How important is money? Because people are more concerned about money now than ever before, and for very good reason. Bills are going up, wages aren't matching that increase, and yet we're all told it's somehow our fault. And Kaiji, despite being a series which came out 3 decades ago, manages to capture all of this perfectly. It's quite funny how the villain of this story, this disgustingly sadistic, brutally cruel, outright sickening old man, shares a lot of beliefs with your average boomer on Facebook, complaining about how young people have it so easy these days. Like, seriously, you'll be shocked by just how similar they are. But firstly, when it comes to the phrase, "oh, money doesn't matter," in my opinion, it's really just not that simple. While sure, you probably do get to the point where it doesn't really improve your quality of life anymore, that's not the majority of us. It's certainly not me. Money absolutely matters when you're worrying about whether you can pay for rent and food, etc. And I'll come back to myself and the money from this channel, etc. in a bit, but Ito Kaiji, the series' main character, lives a life of stagnation and decadence, set in the middle of Japan's last decade, with unemployment at incredibly high rates and the economy stagnating. He sees no hope for the future. He can't get a job anywhere, and even if he did, it wouldn't really pay enough for him to do anything, and so he passes his days with mindless distraction, driven mad by his situation, miserable and hopeless. Until one day, a loan shark shows up. Not for him, but for a loan he co-signed for a co-worker many years ago. Relatively small at the time, but a diabolic interest rate has ballooned it to just shy of 4 million yen. About $30,000 in today's money once you account for inflation and conversion, etc. And salaries are also quite a bit lower in Japan than the US, so it's even more than it sounds. As such, he faces either a life of barely scraping enough to get by, never saving anything, having no hope of ever owning his own place, etc., i.e. just life in the UK right now, or a night of gambling on a very, very sketchy ship, where if he wins, he has a chance of escaping that debt. And yes, this is the series which inspired Squid Game. Now, just for full transparency, I live in the UK and I still work full-time alongside this channel, which really surprised a lot of people because they go, "oh, well, you've got 140,000 subs." But besides the fact that your subscriber count has zero effect on how much you pay and doesn't actually really mean anything anyway, the channel just doesn't make enough for me to live off with the state we're in right now. However, whilst it will still be a long time before I can get a house deposit, you get the idea, right? It's not change my life in terms of how I live and what's around me, but it does bring enough that, combined with my job as well, my car needs a part replaced or my computer's keyboard needs replacing or whatever, I'm not going to be up at night stressing about how I'm going to be able to afford it. I can actually put aside a little bit to save each month. There's some hope for the future, neither of which was the case before this channel started to grow. And I'm aware of how incredibly lucky I am. I'm very blessed to be able to say that, because if it was not for the success of this channel, despite working full time, I would have basically zero hope for the future. But that was not the case a few decades ago, and Kaiji spells this out pretty explicitly. There's a point in one of the later games where he has to go to this hotel that's been converted into this nightmarish pit, where the ultra-rich watch the participants walk across a narrow steel beam, meters up in the air, forced to push each other off if they want to win. But this whole city the hotel was in was supposed to be for the next generation. When the bubble burst, these private companies bought it all up, with not a single care for how it would affect anyone. How many lives could have changed for the better if they hadn't done so? Or because it lets these people with more money than they have a clue what to do with have this one evening of excitement once in a blue moon. And I doubt you need any convincing that there's a ton of people out there with this exact mindset, which leads me on to the villain of this series in Hyodo. Now, Hyodo makes his money purely off things with an essentially guaranteed return, renting out properties, casinos, loans, essentially all ways in which he earns money simply on account of having a lot of money already. Someone like me couldn't open a casino because I couldn't afford to pay out any initial losses. Likewise, I can't start giving out loans because I don't have the money to spare. But Hyodo can. He can just wait for time to bring his money back. And we see this idea of the rich gets richer all throughout Kaiji. At the start of season 2, in this underground labor camp, the villain of this arc, the manager of the workers, is able to amass this absurd sum of wealth because he had the money to briefly go to the surface. Whilst he was up there, he got these custom-made dice, which he could then use to rig the gambling matches and get richer and richer. Again, not through any sort of skill, just purely because things were rigged in his favour. And going back to Hyodo, we don't know anything about his younger years. What kind of family he was born into, etc. But the point here is pretty obvious, right? And I feel like we see this a lot in real life, or maybe not a lot, but certainly far too often. The main example being people who are just born into wealth, or even just happen to be born a lot earlier, back when properties were far more affordable, can now just rent several of them out and never have to worry about money again. Sneering and looking down on those pushed into hard times by the exact actions they're taking, by being this pointless middleman that just spikes rent up and makes it impossible for anyone to afford their own place. And yet they'll forever be convinced that this money comes from some great intelligence of theirs, right? Some incredible smart, some brilliant decision, when in reality, they've not done anything spectacular, they just happen to have a lot of money initially. And there was a great experiment on Monopoly players which showed this exact behaviour. At random, one of the players was chosen to start with twice as much money, roll twice as many dice, etc. All these kind of advantages which massively rigged the game in their favour. And yet the vast majority of them not only believed it was down to their own skill and not all these initial benefits, but they also tried to convince everyone else around them that that was the case. And we see exactly this in Hyodo. There's a part in Kaiji where he's stuck in this underground labour camp, which I'll also come back to. But he earns enough to win a brief pass to the outside. The only way he could possibly earn enough to permanently buy both his and his comrades' freedom is by winning the jackpot on this giant, extremely rigged pachinko machine at one of TI's casinos. That's only ever paid out twice, surprise surprise, to Hyodo and his right-hand man. We soon find out that there's a whole bunch of things going on behind the scenes that can be changed to make it significantly harder or easier to win. And yet, in spite of knowing it was rigged in his favour, and all of his workers knowing it was rigged in his favour, he still tries to play it off otherwise, claiming only the most skilled and accomplished individuals can win. It tests a man's worth, their skill, luck and personality. Definitely not just whoever owns the remote, which tilts the machine forward. And on the subject of the underground labour camp, I think the most common yet frustrating belief that you hear from people that oppose a lot of what I've said is this whole idea of, oh, this generation is only poor because they buy Netflix and coffee, etc. Besides how easy it is to just put up data showing the absurd rise in both housing prices and groceries relative to wages, the £5 on Netflix is not the issue here, but I feel like Kaiji addresses this whole sentiment in perhaps the best example I've seen of why it is just so completely absurd. The camp Kaiji is sent to is brutal and dehumanizing, backbreaking, unsafe labor, the absolute bare minimum food and bedding, with zero entertainment or respite from it all. Two paths are laid out in front of him. Either live off nothing, scrape every penny together, and maybe 15 years from now he can be free if nothing happens. But obviously something is inevitably going to happen to him, working 7 days a week down here in this dangerous, dirty hellhole. So really, that's a pipe dream. Or the second route is that he spends just a little bit of money each time to actually have some sort of respite from it all. And maybe it takes him 16 years instead, but these little expenditures actually keep him sane. Now in the series, Kaiji does struggle to control his desire to ration his money out, with the foreman pressuring him to keep buying. But whilst Kaiji's circumstances are obviously totally different to anyone watching this, when you get these people that say, well, if you're complaining about money, just stop paying for Netflix and a coffee every other week. This is really what they're expecting from you. Work a hard job, come back, eat nothing, do nothing, sleep, and repeat for 2 decades. In fact, get a second job and start doing that on weekends too, the same way Kaiji works every single day. Even though that doesn't even change his circumstances, and he'd still never really be able to get anything for himself. Yet according to these people, that's what he should do. That's his issue here, that he's not doing all of that, and not the fact that he's simply just not paid enough. Now obviously yes, in Kaiji's case, he did end up here because of, reckless gambling, But nowadays, a good chunk of people are in these circumstances just on account of the state of the economy. But why does this happen? Why are people left to struggle so much whilst their CEO buys a 40th yacht and has more money than they know what to do with, whilst their employees aren't paid enough? Instead of, them only having 2 yachts and their employees actually having enough money. Kyoto gives the very honest, simple truth. When he first meets Kaiji, he gives him a surprisingly open speech. He admits that he has the money to help, but simply won't. The reason? He demonstrates rather than explains, by violently beating one of the victims of the steel beam race with broken legs. Whether he suffers or not is of no concern. Only my own happiness matters. His pain does not affect me. It's effortless for him to push that to one side, even when it's right in front of him. No amount of convincing him would change that. There's nothing that can be said to him to make him change his opinion. And what's more, he claims those who would cry over the unfairness of life and claim we should help each other disgust me. Why don't they send money instead? Just completely ignoring the fact that obviously they don't have billions to give away like he does. How is Kaiji, working at this minimum wage job, ever supposed to give away money when he's not even making enough to live? And I love how the series really captures the feel of these jobs perfectly, with the expectation to go above and beyond with zero actual reward for doing so, and not even really being paid enough initially anyway. Now obviously there is a ton more nuance to everything I said in this video that I just really didn't have time to go through. Really, this video just kind of ended up being me ranting about certain attitudes online and how Kaiji kind of shows examples of this. However, I do of course completely agree, and I'm sure I'll get a ton of comments from people who didn't watch up to this point mentioning this, but yes, Kaiji at the start of the series, and honestly a fair chunk of the other people who end up in these games, are the type of people that are just very difficult to help. And I do speak about this in my recent video on Kaiji, it's one of my shortest videos, but Endo's basketball analogy at the start really nails it. It's a bit of a loop of there's no hope, so they act this way so they have even less hope. But when the basketball net is up so high, it's no wonder no one tries to throw a shot at it, when there's no real hope of anything coming from it. Of course, yes, Kaiji's peers at the start of the series are absolute losers. They are very much just giving in to base pleasures, don't take enough responsibility for themselves, etc, etc. But how many of them would still be like that if that basketball ring was in reach? Some of them probably would be, yes, but Endo even says to Kaiji, you wouldn't be like this, going around vandalizing cars and being a degenerate, if you had money, if you could afford to do things and buy things you wanted. And when he does end up getting a job later on, don't you think his attitude towards it would be totally different? If it paid enough for him to buy a house and support a whole family on this one wage, the way things used to be, as opposed to him barely making enough to get by. And that's the crazy thing about this series, that you can make these comparisons to Kaiji, but with how things used to be, he's only in this situation because of an absurd debt that was forced onto him out of nowhere. That wasn't his fault, whereas now that can just be the stand for someone who is working a normal job. They have also had this awful economic situation forced onto them through no fault of their own. Now, I've spent the last day or so trying to figure out how to end this video. I didn't just want to end on Kyoto's speech again like I did in the previous Kaiji video, which you should check out if you enjoyed this one, but whilst I don't know exactly what can be done about this, I do know that of all the ideas floating around out there of what to do, none of them will ever happen as long as what Kyoto says carries weight. Man is willing to bear extraordinary things if one simply waves a bit of money under their noses. It is that eagerness which allows the rich to live in ease. If the poor were all to agree that they had no need of money, the king would disappear. However, this will never happen, because in desperation to become the king themselves, they strive for money, reinforcing the position of the king. However, a king must still be careful. He must dispense to each of them their own fair share of satisfaction, although in truth, he works them to their very bones.